the stranger in the background of every photo I take. Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. Today is a super exciting day, and it's all thanks to you. We've officially hit 1,080 subscribers. I mean, wow, 1,080. To some people, it might just be a number, but to me, it's a reminder of how far we've come together. All right, let's cut to the chase. This story isn't one of those slow burn types. No fluff, no overthinking. It started on a regular weekend, and trust me, it escalated way faster than I could handle. Saturday morning, the sun's out, people are buzzing, and I've got my trusty camera slung around my neck. I'm not some artsy photographer or anything. It's just a hobby. Snap a few pictures, post them online, maybe get a few likes. You know the drill. Anyway, I'm in the park, trying to get the perfect shot of this guy juggling for a group of kids. Click. Perfect timing. The ball arcs midair, everyone's laughing, and the lighting, chef's kiss. But then I glance at the screen to check my shot, and something's off. There's a figure in the background. Dark hoodie, hands in pockets, just standing there. Weird. But hey, it's a public park. People linger. Move on. By the afternoon, I'm in the heart of the city. Food trucks lined up, live music playing, and I'm snapping pics of anything that catches my eye. The mural artists, a street performer juggling flaming torches, a couple sharing fries. Normal stuff, until I zoom in on one of the shots later. Him again. Same hoodie, same pose. Seems like he's waiting for something. Okay, twice? That's weird. But I've got places to be, and I'm not about to ruin my weekend over some random dude who might just like standing around. It wasn't until I got home, though, that I started feeling it. That creeping unease. I'm sitting on my couch, scrolling through the photos on my laptop, and there he is. Not in 2, not in 5. He's in every single one. Every single shot. Park, market, even that random alley I ducked into for an iced coffee. Always in the background, blurry, but undeniable. Now, I'm not the type to freak out easily, but come on, what are the odds? My first instinct? Ignore it. Delete the photos, chalk it up to a coincidence, and move on. But no, that'd be too easy, wouldn't it? So here I am, pulling out my camera like it's some kind of weapon, determined to figure out what's going on. Because if I don't, I'm pretty sure this guy's not just going to stay in the background. It was supposed to be a day like any other. I had the entire afternoon to kill. So I decided to head to the park. A new lens had just arrived for my camera, and I was itching to test it out. The place was alive. Kids laughing, joggers weaving through the paths, and an older couple feeding the ducks by the pond. It was perfect for capturing those small, fleeting moments that made the city feel alive. I spotted a golden retriever chasing a frisbee, its tail wagging so hard it could have powered a wind turbine. I knelt down, lining up the shot to get just the right angle. Click. The camera shutter snapped, and I smiled at the result. A frozen moment of pure joy. But when I glanced at the preview, something caught my eye. In the background, past the happy dog and its cheering owner, stood a figure, dressed in a dark hoodie, their face shadowed by the sun. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, watching. It was odd, but not alarming. People stand around all the time, right? I moved on, snapping more pictures as I wandered deeper into the park. There was a family having a picnic under a massive oak tree, a couple rowing in the small pond, and a street musician strumming a guitar near the fountain. Each shot felt like a slice of life, captured in its purest form. But every time I checked the photos, there he was again. Same hoodie, same stance. Always in the background, never close enough to see his face. Just there. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just some random guy enjoying the park, showing up in my shots purely by chance. But as the hours passed and I moved to different parts of the city, the coincidences started piling up. By late afternoon, I was at the farmer's market downtown. The air was filled with the smell of roasted coffee and fresh bread, the chatter of vendors and customers blending into a pleasant hum. I snapped a photo of a fruit stand overflowing with vibrant oranges and apples. Checking the preview, I froze. He was there again. This time, he was closer. Not close enough to seem aggressive, but definitely closer than he'd been before. Standing near a lamppost, half turned like he wasn't even trying to hide anymore. Looked up from my camera and scanned the crowd, but I couldn't see him anywhere. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. My heart started racing, not with fear, but with a weird mix of confusion and frustration. Who was this guy? And why did he keep showing up in my photos? By the time I got home that evening, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a random guy in the same place as me. But as I transferred the photos to my laptop and started going through them, one by one, the unease settled back in. He wasn't just in a few of the photos. He was in almost all of them. Park, market, alleyway, even a random shot I'd taken of a street mural. Always the same hoodie, always the same pose. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. This wasn't normal. This wasn't coincidence. And as much as I wanted to shrug it off and move on, something about the stranger felt deliberate. Like he wasn't just some guy who happened to be there. Like he wanted me to notice him. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing there, silent and unmoving, like a shadow that refused to fade. It was the first time I realized this wasn't just a random series of events. It was the beginning of something far bigger and far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. It started innocently enough, just a nagging curiosity I couldn't shake. Who was the stranger in the hoodie? Why did he keep showing up in my photos? I told myself it was probably nothing, just some random coincidence. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I spent hours that night poring over every photo I'd taken that day. Park, market, alleyway, even the bridge by the river. He was there, always there. It wasn't just the hoodie or the stance that gave him away. It was something in the way he seemed to blend into the background, like he belonged but didn't at the same time. He was just wrong. The next day, I tried to push it out of my mind. I went to work, answered emails, and ran errands. Everything as normal, but every free moment, I found myself scrolling through the photos again, zooming in on his figure, trying to make out his face. It was like a splinter in my brain, impossible to ignore. Then I started noticing other things, little things. It wasn't just the photos. I'd catch glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye, a figure across the street, someone standing at the edge of a crowd, always the same hoodie, the same posture, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Paranoia, maybe. But then it happened again and again. Once at the coffee shop, where I grabbed my morning latte. Another time at the grocery store. Once, I even saw him reflected in the glass doors of my office building. Each time, he'd be gone the moment I turned to look. That's when the obsession really began. I stayed up late that night, combing through the internet, looking for any clue. Hooded figure stalking photos turned up nothing useful, just urban legends and conspiracy theories. Unknown man in photos gave me a bunch of poorly edited ghost stories. The forums were worse. Half of the posts were trolls, and the other half were so absurd I couldn't take them seriously. But one post caught my attention. It was buried in a thread about unexplained phenomena. A guy claimed he'd been seeing the same figure in the background of his photos for years. He described it exactly as I'd seen. A man in a dark hoodie, always distant, always blurry. He even uploaded a few photos as proof, but the thread had been abandoned for years. No replies, no follow-up. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. The next day, I decided I wasn't going to let it go. To identify him, I took my camera and went out. If he wanted to keep showing up in my photos, fine. I'd give him a chance. But this time, I was ready for him. I went back to the park, the market, even the coffee shop. I snapped pictures of everything: trees, benches, murals, and crowds. I wasn't looking for beauty or creativity. I was hunting. Every few shots, I'd stop to check the screen, scanning for him. Hours passed. Nothing. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, frustrated. Maybe I'd scared him off, or maybe it really had been some weird coincidence. But as I transferred the day's photos to my laptop, my heart sank. There he was again. Not in the park, not at the market, but standing at the edge of a crosswalk I'd barely noticed while snapping a picture of a food truck. Same hoodie, same distance. Like he was toying with me, letting me know he was still there. After that, I couldn't stop. Every free moment was spent scrolling through old photos, combing through every detail. The obsession consumed me. I stopped going out with friends. I started missing work deadlines. All I could think about was him. I went back years. Photos from vacations, birthdays, even random shots I'd taken as a teenager. And I found him. Not in every photo, but enough to make my skin crawl. Sometimes it was a silhouette in the distance, sometimes just a shadow, but it was always him. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. He'd been following me for years, maybe my entire life, and I had no idea why. By the second week, I wasn't sleeping. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced I'd hear footsteps outside my window or see his shadow in the hallway. Every knock at the door and every creak on the floorboards sent my heart racing. One night, I decided I needed proof, real proof. If no one else could see him, I'd make them. So, I packed my bag, grabbed my camera, and headed out into the city, determined to catch him in the act. It was midnight when I saw him, not in a photo this time, in real life. He was standing across the street from my apartment, motionless, staring straight at my window. For a moment, I froze, unsure if it was real or my sleep-deprived brain playing tricks on me. Then, without thinking, I raised my camera and snapped a picture. The flash lit up the street for half a second, and when I lowered the camera, he was gone. The moment I lowered the camera and realized he was gone, my heart slammed against my chest like a drumbeat. My first instinct was to bolt inside, lock every door, and pretend none of this was happening. But something stopped me. A mix of frustration, anger, and adrenaline. I'd spent weeks being haunted by this guy. If he thought he could just vanish into the night again, he was wrong. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed my camera into the bag, and sprinted outside. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. No cars, no late-night joggers, not even the usual hum of distant traffic. But I could feel him, like the air had thickened, weighted by his presence. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, scanning the dimly lit sidewalks and the alleyways that branched off into darkness. Then I saw him, just a flash, a figure slipping around the corner at the end of the block. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty street. I didn't think. I just ran. My sneakers pounded against the pavement as I sprinted toward the corner. I knew it was reckless, but I didn't care. All I could think was, this is my chance. I'm going to catch him. I rounded the corner and caught a glimpse of him again, further down the alley. He wasn't running. He was walking, calmly, like he knew I couldn't catch him. That pissed me off even more. I pushed harder, closing the gap between us. "Who the hell are you?" I yelled. No response. The alley was narrow, lined with dumpsters and fire escapes. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move with him. I was getting closer now, close enough to make out the details of his hoodie, the frayed edges, the faint stains on the fabric. He was real, not some ghost, not a hallucination, a real person. And then he turned. For the first time, I saw his face, or at least part of it. Pale skin, dark eyes, and an expression that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something else, something cold, calculating. He smirked. That's when I realized he wasn't running, because he didn't need to. This wasn't a chase. It was a game. The alley opened up into a larger courtyard, surrounded by high brick walls. A dead end. My heart leapt. This was it. I had him cornered. He stopped in the middle of the courtyard, hands in his pockets, as if waiting for me. I slowed to a walk, my chest heaving. "You're not getting away this time," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. My hand gripped the strap of my camera bag, ready to pull it out and snap a photo. He didn't move, didn't say a word. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Why are you following me?" Still nothing. The silence was suffocating. My adrenaline was spiking, and my instincts were screaming at me to back away. But I ignored them. I took a step closer, then another. The camera was in my hand now, the lens trained on him. "Say something," I shouted, and that's when I heard your footsteps, not his. From behind me, I spun around just in time to see two more figures emerging from the shadows. Hooded, just like him. One of them was holding something, a crowbar maybe? My brain didn't have time to process it. The first guy started moving toward me, calm and deliberate, while the others closed in from behind. This wasn't just one guy stalking me anymore. It was a coordinated effort, a trap. My instincts finally kicked in. I bolted. I darted back through the alley, dodging dumpsters and broken glass. The sound of their footsteps was deafening now, echoing off the walls as they chased me. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I turned a corner, then another, trying to lose them in the maze of alleys. For a moment, I thought I'd shaken them, but then I heard it, a metallic clang, as one of them kicked over a trash can. Too close for comfort. Up ahead, I saw a fire escape ladder hanging just low enough to reach. Without thinking, I jumped, grabbing onto the cold, rusted metal and pulling myself up. My arms felt like they were going to give out, but adrenaline pushed me higher. I climbed onto the second story, landing and pressed myself flat against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. From below, I heard them shouting, "Where'd he go? Check the other side." Their voices faded as they split up, searching for me. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, until the only sound was the distant hum of the city. I climbed the rest of the fire escape to the roof and crouched low, scanning the streets below. They were gone, or at least, I couldn't see them anymore. My heart was still racing, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my camera. I pulled it out of my bag and checked the screen. I'd snapped a photo during the chase, purely by accident. The image was blurry, but it showed enough. 3 figures, hooded and menacing, their faces turned toward the camera as they ran after me. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't just being followed. I was being hunted. Barely slept that night. The events of the chase replayed in my mind like a broken record. The cold look in his eyes, the calculated way they surrounded me, the realization that this wasn't random. It was deliberate. I was in their crosshairs now. The photo I'd taken during the chase was still open on my laptop. Blurry as it was, it gave me my first clear lead. There wasn't just one of them. There were 3, maybe more, and they were organized. This wasn't just about stalking me. I needed to figure out their plan before they caught up. I zoomed in on the image, trying to pull out any details. The hoodies were plain, with no logos or designs to give away where they came from. Their faces were mostly shadowed, but there was one thing that stood out. On the wrist of the guy in the foreground, a tattoo peeked out from under his sleeve. It was faint, but distinct. Some kind of symbol, like a broken circle with a line through it. That was my starting point. I spent the next few hours diving into forums and image searches, trying to identify the tattoo. It wasn't easy. There were thousands of possibilities, from gang symbols to obscure cult emblems. But just as I was about to give up, I found a match. It wasn't a perfect replica, but it was close enough. The symbol was tied to a group known as the Shadows. Not much was known about them, but the threads I found painted a chilling picture. They operated in secret, targeting individuals seemingly at random. Surveillance, stalking, intimidation, those were their calling cards. And if the stories were to be believed, once they marked you, they didn't stop until they got what they wanted. The question was, what did they want from me? The tattoo wasn't much to go on, but it was better than nothing. I spent the next day retracing my steps, going back to the places where I'd seen the stranger in my photos. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a clue, maybe a way to draw them out. But I couldn't just sit at home and wait. At the park, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Same joggers, same families, same guide juggling for tips near the fountain. I snapped a few photos, just in case. But the figure wasn't there. The market was the same. Crowds bustled around me, and vendors shouted about fresh produce and handmade jewelry, but there was no sign of them. No dark hoodies, no cold stares. It wasn't until I reached the alley behind the coffee shop that I found something. Tucked into the corner, half buried under a pile of trash, was a scrap of fabric, dark gray, frayed at the edges. I picked it up and recognized it immediately. It was the same material as the hoodie the stranger had been wearing. The fabric wasn't the only thing I found. Beneath it, there was a torn flyer with an address scrawled on the back. It was smudged, barely legible, but I managed to make it out. 546 Haven Street. My gut told me this was important. It could trap me or give me a break. Either way, I wasn't going to let this slip through my fingers. That night, I packed a bag with everything I thought I'd need. My camera, a flashlight, a pocket knife I'd barely used before, but now felt essential, and a heavy-duty flashlight that doubled as a blunt weapon if things went sideways. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I wasn't going to go unprepared. Haven Street was on the outskirts of the city, a desolate stretch of industrial buildings and abandoned warehouses. The kind of place where no one would hear you scream. I parked a block away and approached on foot, sticking to the shadows. The warehouse at 546 was massive, its windows boarded up, and its walls covered in graffiti. A faint light flickered inside, just enough to let me know it wasn't completely abandoned. The door was ajar. Typical. Either they were inviting me in, or someone else had already been here. My hand tightened around the flashlight as I stepped inside. The air inside was cold and damp, smelling of rust and mildew. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, scraps of metal, empty cans. But what caught my attention was the sound, a faint hum, almost mechanical, coming from deeper inside. I followed it, weaving through a maze of crates and rusted machinery. The light grew brighter as I got closer, until I reached a large, open space in the center of the warehouse. That's when I saw it. A wall of photos, hundreds of them, pinned to a corkboard that stretched from floor to ceiling. All of them were mine. Some were recent, shots I recognized from my own outings, but others were older, much older. Photos from places I hadn't been in years. Vacations, family gatherings. There were even pictures of me as a kid, playing in my backyard, taken from angles that no stranger should have had access to. At the center of the board was a single photo, larger than the rest. It was from that night, the one I'd taken of the stranger standing across the street from my apartment. But this time, his face wasn't blurry. It was crystal clear. Before I could process what I was looking at, the hum grew louder. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the shadows behind me. "Well, you found us," a voice said, calm, mocking. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The stranger stood there, flanked by two others, their faces obscured by masks. My heart was pounding, my grip on the flashlight slick with sweat. "Why?" I demanded. "What do you want from me?" The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I raised the flashlight, ready to swing, but before I could, the other two lunged. I don't remember much about the fight. It was chaos. Flashes of fists, the crack of metal against concrete, the sting of blood in my mouth. Somehow, I managed to scramble out of their grip and stumble into the maze of crates, using the cluttered space to put distance between us. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through every inch of my body. I was outnumbered, but I wasn't about to give up. They didn't chase me immediately. Instead, I heard their footsteps slow, their voices murmuring in a language I couldn't place. It wasn't panic, it was strategy. They weren't just a bunch of thugs. These people knew exactly what they were doing. I crouched behind a stack of rusted metal drums, struggling to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. A door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. It wasn't the way I came in, but it might be my way out. Moving as quietly as I could, I crept toward the door. My head was spinning, my muscles burning, but I forced myself to keep going. The voices were growing louder, closer, but they hadn't spotted me yet. When I slipped through the door, I froze. The room was nothing like the rest of the warehouse. It was clean, almost clinical, with rows of monitors lining the walls. Each screen displayed live feeds from cameras, streets, parks, apartments, familiar places, my places. They'd been watching me for a long time. I stepped closer, my eyes darting across the screens. One showed the park, where I'd first noticed the stranger in my photos. Another was pointed at the alley behind the coffee shop. But the worst one was the feed of my apartment. The angle was perfect, looking straight into my living room. On the desk beneath the monitors was a stack of files. I grabbed one and flipped it open. Inside were pages of notes, photos, and maps. Everything about me. My name, my schedule, places I frequented, even personal details I'd never shared with anyone. There were similar files stacked nearby, labeled with other names. I wasn't the only one. Before I could process it all, a voice crackled through a nearby speaker. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I spun around, flashlight raised, but no one was there. The voice was coming from the monitors. "You're resourceful. I'll give you that. But you're in over your head." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The monitors flickered, and a new image appeared. A logo. A broken circle with a line through it. The same symbol as the tattoo. "We're everywhere," the voice said. "We see everything. You've been chosen, and there's no escape." "Chosen for what?" I shouted, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, the monitors switched again, this time showing live feeds of the warehouse. The stranger and his accomplices were moving through the building, searching for me. One of them stopped, looking directly into the camera. "He's in the control room," the voice said. I didn't wait. Grabbing as many of the files as I could carry, I bolted out the door on the opposite side of the room. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me. Faster now, more frantic. They knew exactly where I was. The hallway was narrow, lined with pipes and flickering lights. I rounded a corner and found a staircase leading down. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, but something caught my eye. Another door. This one marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open. Inside was a server room, the hum of machinery drowning out the chaos outside. Racks of blinking hardware filled the space, wires snaking across the floor. At the center of the room was a single console, its screen glowing with lines of code. This was it, their network, the brain of the operation. I didn't know much about hacking, but I didn't need to. The console was logged in, wide open, and begging for someone to hit the wrong button. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for just a moment. If I did this, there was no turning back. Then I heard the footsteps again, closing in fast. I started typing, deleting files, disabling cameras, and crashing systems. The screens around me flashed red, error messages popping up one after another. The hum of the servers grew louder, almost angry, as if the machines themselves were protesting. Suddenly, the door burst open. The stranger stood there, his face shadowed, but his anger palpable. Without thinking, I grabbed the closest thing, a heavy server component, and hurled it at him. It wasn't enough to knock him out, but it bought me a few precious seconds. I turned back to the console and hit the final command. Purge all. The servers roared to life, their lights flickering wildly before plunging into darkness. The room was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't wait to see the aftermath. With the files clutched to my chest, I barreled past the stranger, shoving him into the wall as I sprinted for the exit. The warehouse was in chaos now. Alarms blaring, red lights flashing. I burst through the front door and into the night, my legs barely carrying me to the car. Throwing the files onto the passenger seat, I floored it, the warehouse shrinking in, my rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my mind racing as fast as the car. I had the files, the evidence, but I just destroyed a piece of something much larger, and I knew they wouldn't let that go unanswered. I didn't go home that night, or the next. I drove aimlessly, stopping only for gas and cheap food from roadside diners. My phone stayed off, its screen dark and useless. Paranoia clung to me like a second skin. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like a threat. Every passing stranger, a potential spy. By the time I finally stopped, I was hundreds of miles from the city, holed up in a motel that smelled of mildew and broken promises. The files I'd taken from the warehouse were spread across the bed, a chaotic mess of papers, photos, and maps. The more I read, the more the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about me. The shadows, as the group called themselves, had been watching dozens, maybe hundreds, of people, tracking their movements, collecting their data. But for what purpose? I still didn't know. At some point, exhaustion got the better of me. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is the sharp knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the pocket knife from the nightstand, creeping toward the door, with every nerve on edge. "Who is it?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best effort. "I can help you," a voice replied. A woman's voice, calm but urgent. "If you don't open this door, you're going to die." Not exactly comforting. I peered through the peephole. She was alone, or at least, she looked alone. Late 30s, dark hair tied back, wearing a leather jacket that had seen better days. She didn't look like one of them, but then again, what did I know? "Who are you?" I demanded. "Someone who's been where you are," she said. "Now open the door, before they track us both." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door, keeping the pocket knife hidden, but ready. She stepped inside, her movements quick and deliberate, like someone who didn't have time to waste. "You're lucky I found you first," she said, glancing at the files scattered across the bed. "They don't leave loose ends." Her name was Mara, and according to her, she used to work for the shadows. Not directly, she wasn't high-ranking enough to know their full agenda, but enough to understand how they operated. "They target people with potential," she explained, pacing the room. "Leaders, innovators, and disruptors. They watch them, study them, and when the time's right, they recruit them." "Recruit them for what?" I asked. She hesitated. "That's the part I don't know. Some join willingly. Others don't get a choice." I leaned back against the wall, the weight of her words sinking in. "And what about me? What do they want from me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up one of the files, flipping through it with practiced ease. "Whatever it is, you've already pissed them off by fighting back. That makes you a liability." Her tone was matter of fact, but the implication was clear. They wouldn't stop until I was dealt with. I didn't fully trust her. How could I? For all I knew, this was a setup, a way to lure me out of hiding. But I didn't have many options, and Mara seemed to know more about the shadows than anyone I'd encountered so far. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, watching her carefully. "Because I couldn't help myself," she said, her voice softer now. "I was like you once. Marked, hunted. I ran for years, trying to stay one step ahead. But they always catch up, one way or another. I got lucky. Someone pulled me out before it was too late. And now you're paying it forward?" She shrugged. "Something like that." It wasn't the most convincing answer, but it would have to do. Mara spread the files out on the bed, tracing her finger over one of the maps. "This," she said, tapping a point circled in red. "This is their main hub. It's where they store everything. Data, files, surveillance feeds. If we can get inside, we might be able to figure out what they really want." "You want to break into their headquarters?" I said, incredulous. "That's your plan?" "It's the only way to stop them," she said. "Destroy the hub, and you cut off their ability to track you, at least for a while." "And then what? I just go back to my life and pretend none of this happened?" Mara looked at me, her expression unreadable. "There's no going back. Not after this." The plan sounded insane, but it also felt like my only chance. I agreed to go along with it, but the tension between us was palpable. Every move Mara made Every word she said, I questioned. Was she really trying to help me, or was she leading me straight into a trap? As we packed up the files and prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. One of the files, a photo of me from years ago, was missing. I didn't mention it to Mara, but my mind raced. Had she taken it? Was it an accident, or something more sinister? The doubts festered as we drove toward the hub, turning every glance, every word, into a potential betrayal. We reached the outskirts of the hub, a sprawling, heavily fortified compound hidden in plain sight as an abandoned factory. Mara laid out the final details of the plan, but I wasn't listening. My mind was fixated on the missing photo and the growing suspicion that I was walking into a trap. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. How do I know I can trust you? I demanded, my voice cutting through the silence. Mara turned to me, her eyes hard. You don't, she said. But if you want to survive this, you don't have a choice. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I hated that she was right. The compound loomed in the distance, a monolith of steel and concrete wrapped in razor wire. From the outside, it looked abandoned. No lights, no movement. But we both knew better. This was their hub, the nerve center of the Shadow's operation. If we were going to end this, it had to happen here. Mara killed the engine, and we sat in silence for a moment. The plan was simple on paper. Get in, destroy the servers, get out. But simple didn't mean easy, and my stomach churned at the thought of what we were about to face. You ready? She asked, her tone calm and steady. I nodded, gripping the flashlight in one hand and the pocket knife in the other. Let's do this. We moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as we approached the compound. The perimeter was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Mara had warned me about motion sensors and hidden cameras, but she seemed to know exactly where to step, guiding me through the maze of potential traps. At the side of the building, we found an access hatch partially concealed by overgrown weeds. Mara pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a dark tunnel that reeked of damp metal and decay. After you, she said with a smirk. I slid inside, the flashlight casting long shadows as we descended into the unknown. The tunnel led to a lower level of the compound, a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors lined with exposed wires and flickering fluorescent lights. The air buzzed with the low hum of machinery, a constant reminder of the power this place held. As we moved deeper, Mara whispered instructions, pointing out tripwires and bypassing locked doors with a set of tools she'd brought along. It was clear she'd done this before, and despite my lingering doubts, I couldn't deny she was talented at what she did. Finally, we reached the server room. It was massive, a cavernous space filled with racks of blinking hardware. At the center was a control console, its screen glowing with lines of code. This is it, Mara said, pulling a USB drive from her jacket. Plug this in, and it'll take care of the rest. I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. If we did this, there was no going back. Mara, I said, my voice low. Why are you really helping me? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the console, her expression unreadable. Because I couldn't stop them before, she said finally. But maybe I can now. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was enough. I took the USB and approached the console. Just as I plugged in the drive, the alarms blared. Red lights flooded the room, and the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Mara cursed under her breath, pulling a gun from her waistband. "They're here." The door burst open, and the first of them stormed in. 3 men in tactical gear, armed to the teeth. Mara didn't hesitate. She fired twice, dropping one of them, while I dove behind a rack of servers. The remaining 2 opened fire, the deafening roar of gunshots reverberating through the room. I clutched the flashlight like a lifeline, my hands shaking as I crawled toward the console. The USB was still connected, its light blinking as it uploaded the virus. Just a little longer. Mara shouted something I couldn't hear over the chaos. I peeked out from behind the server rack to see her pinned down, her gun empty. One of the men advanced on her, his weapon raised. Without thinking, I grabbed a loose piece of metal from the floor and hurled it at him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to distract him for a split second. Mara took advantage, slamming into him with enough force to knock him to the ground. Just when I thought we might have a chance, the door opened again, and he walked in, the stranger from my photos. He wasn't wearing the hoodie this time. Instead, he was dressed in all black, his face calm and composed, like he wasn't walking into a war zone. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The remaining attacker stopped immediately, retreating to his side like a dog obeying its master. Mara and I froze, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. "You've caused quite a mess," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "But it ends here." "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He smiled, cold and unfeeling. "You've been chosen. We've been watching you for years, shaping and testing you, and now it's time to fulfill your purpose." "I don't want anything to do with you," I shouted. "It's not up to you," he said. "It never was." Before he could say more, Mara lunged at him, her movements swift and brutal. They fought hand to hand, a clash of skill and raw determination. I used the distraction to crawl back to the console, watching as the upload bar crept closer to completion. The stranger gained the upper hand, throwing Mara to the ground with a brutal kick. He turned to me, his expression darkening. "Do you really think this will stop us?" I didn't answer. I slammed my hand onto the keyboard, triggering the final command. The room erupted in chaos as the servers began to spark and overload. The lights flickered wildly, alarms blaring louder than ever. The stranger's calm demeanor cracked for the first time, his eyes narrowing in anger. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a low growl. Mara grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit as the room filled with smoke. "We have to go now." We ran, dodging falling debris and the shouts of reinforcements closing in. The compound was collapsing around us, the virus tearing through its systems like wildfire. By the time we reached the surface, the building was engulfed in flames. We didn't stop running until we were miles away, the glow of the fire fading into the distance. My chest heaved with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop thinking about his words. This isn't over. The flames of the compound were long gone in the rearview mirror, but their heat lingered in my chest, a mix of relief and unresolved dread. We had taken down their hub, destroyed their network, But Mara's silence as she drove told me the same thing I already knew. This wasn't over. Back at another motel, another forgettable, grimy room in the middle of nowhere, we sat in silence. The files we'd taken, the USB drive, the evidence, it was all gone, wiped out along with the servers. All we had left was what we'd seen and experienced, and that wasn't enough. They'll rebuild, Mara said finally, breaking the quiet. They always do. I looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. So, what now? She leaned back, running a hand through her hair. You keep running. Stay off the grid. Don't trust anyone. Not the answer I wanted, but the only logical one. The shadows might have taken a hit tonight, but they were too big, too far-reaching to disappear entirely. I wasn't safe. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I spent the next few days learning the art of vanishing. Mara taught me how to ditch my phone, scrub my online presence, and build a new identity. It felt like erasing myself, piece by piece, until I was nothing but a shadow of the person I used to be. But even as I adapted, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car on the street, every stranger who lingered too long in my peripheral vision, it all felt like them, watching, waiting. I changed motels every few days, paid in cash, avoided cameras, and never stayed in one place long enough to leave a trace. It was exhausting, but it was survival. At night, when I was alone with nothing but the hum of the motel air conditioner, the memories came flooding back. The wall of photos in the compound. The stranger's face was calm and calculated. His words, "You've been chosen. It's not up to you." I still didn't know what he meant by that. Why me? What did they see in me that made them decide I was worth tracking? Worth hunting? The questions ate away at me, and the lack of answers was its own kind of torture. I thought about the others, the names and faces on those files. Were they still out there, living normal lives, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched? Or had they already been recruited, taken? The guilt was suffocating. I had stopped their hub, but it hadn't been enough to save anyone, maybe not even myself. One day, I woke up to find Mara gone. She'd left without a word, but she'd left behind a burner phone with a single number saved in its contacts. The message was clear. If I ever needed her, she'd be there. But for now, I was on my own, and maybe that was for the best. I didn't go back to my old life. There was no old life to return to. Instead, I created a new one, built from scratch. A different name, a different face, a different me. But even as I disappeared into the background, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that this wasn't over, that they'd find me again, one way or another, and when they did, I'd be ready. Because for all their power, the shadows had one fatal flaw. They underestimated me. They thought I was just another target, another pawn in their game. But I'd already proven I was willing to fight back, and the next time they came for me, I wouldn't just survive. I'd make sure they never saw it coming. The experience had stripped me of the life I once knew, but it had given me something in return. Clarity. The world wasn't as simple as I'd thought. There were layers, hidden networks, and people pulling strings in ways most would never notice. It was terrifying. Yes, But it was also a challenge. I couldn't stop the shadows on my own. Not completely, but maybe, just maybe, I could find others like me. People who had slipped through their grasp. People who were exhausted of running. Together, we could be more than just survivors. We could be the ones who finally turned the tables. The thought gave me hope. And hope, I realized, was the one thing the shadows couldn't take from me. That's my story. Or at least, the beginning of it. If you've made it this far, maybe you're wondering, is it over? Have I really escaped? The truth is, I don't know. The shadows are still out there, rebuilding, watching, and waiting. And me? I'm still running, still fighting. But here's the thing. I'm not alone. Maybe you've noticed something strange in your own life. A face you can't explain. A presence you can't shake. Maybe you've felt the weight of unseen eyes. The nagging feeling that you're part of something bigger than you realize. If that sounds familiar, don't ignore it. Pay attention. Stay alert. Because the world is changing, and the cracks in its facade are getting harder to ignore. We're all being watched, some more closely than others. But we're not powerless. Not yet. If you've experienced something like this, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment, send me a message, and share your story. Together, maybe we can start piecing together the truth. Maybe we can finally figure out how to stop them. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the shadows are darkest right before the dawn.